I never thought a vacation could change my life. I was just looking for a break. Sun, beaches, tequila, and a chance to escape the exhausting routine back home in the U.S. But Mexico had something much more intense waiting for me. When I met him, everything changed. His piercing gaze, his effortless charm, the way he carried himself, it was intoxicating. One night, one dance, one touch, and suddenly, I was lost in a world of passion I never expected. A desire impossible to resist. A love I never saw coming. An experience I could never forget. What would you do if you fell for someone in a place where you least expected it? Get ready for a story filled with heat, passion, and unexpected love. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss this. Are you ready to take this journey with me? The humid air clung to my skin as I stepped out of the airport and into the heart of Mexico. The scent of grilled street food mixed with the distant salty breeze of the ocean and the chatter of Spanish-speaking locals filled the air. This was exactly what I needed, a complete change of scenery. No work emails, no deadlines, just me, the sun, and endless possibilities. I checked into my hotel, a charming boutique place near the coast. It wasn't too fancy, but it had a balcony with an ocean view and a small pool where I could unwind with a drink in hand. I had no real plan for the trip, just go with the flow and see where the days took me. That night, I wandered into the bustling streets of the town, drawn by the rhythmic pulse of Latin music spilling from open doors of lively bars. The energy was magnetic, people laughing, dancing, moving as if the night itself was alive. I walked into one of the bars, a vibrant little spot with colorful lights and the smell of tequila in the air. And that's when I saw him. He was behind the bar, pouring drinks with effortless confidence. Dark, tousled hair, deep brown eyes, and a smirk that could disarm anyone. He moved with a kind of ease that was impossible to ignore. His black t-shirt hugged his body in just the right way, and his rolled-up sleeves revealed strong arms, a subtle hint of muscle under golden brown skin. He caught me staring. For a moment, time stretched between us. He raised an eyebrow, an amused smirk playing at his lips, and then, without breaking eye contact, he slid a drink across the bar to a waiting customer. It was subtle, but it was enough to send a slow burn through my chest. I sat at the bar, feeling an unexpected rush of nerves. He walked over, resting his hands on the counter as he leaned in slightly. "First time here." His voice was smooth, deep, laced with that unmistakable Mexican accent. I swallowed, suddenly feeling warm in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "Yeah, just arrived today." He nodded, then grabbed a bottle and started pouring without even asking. "Then you need a proper welcome." I watched as he expertly mixed a drink, a teasing smile never leaving his face. When he slid the glass toward me, his fingers barely brushed against mine. It was an innocent touch, barely even there. But damn, it sent a spark through me. I lifted the glass, my heart pounding in a way I didn't quite understand. "What is this?" His smirk deepened. "It's something special. You'll like it." I took a sip. It was smooth, rich, and had just the right amount of kick. I nodded approvingly. "What's your name?" I asked. He tilted his head slightly, as if deciding whether or not to answer. Then he leaned in just a fraction closer. "Diego." The way he said it, slow, deliberate, made my stomach tighten. I hadn't come to Mexico looking for anything. But in that moment, I had the distinct feeling that something had just begun, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. The night pulsed with life. Music spilled from the speakers, mixing with the laughter of tourists and locals alike. My drink was half gone, but the warmth in my chest wasn't just from the alcohol. It was from him. Diego. I watched as he worked behind the bar, effortlessly charming customers, moving with the kind of confidence that made him impossible to ignore. Every now and then, his eyes flickered toward me, a hint of amusement in his expression, as if he could feel the effect he had on me. I told myself it was nothing. A harmless moment, just admiration. But then, he did something that made my pulse spike. He leaned over the bar again, this time closer, his voice lower than before. "You're not like the other tourists." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "What do you mean?" He studied me, dark eyes scanning my face as if he was peeling back layers. "Most guys come here looking for a cheap drink, a wild night. You're different." I laughed, though it came out unsteady. "Is that a compliment?" He smirked, wiping his hands with a bar towel before tossing it over his shoulder. "Depends. Do you want it to be?" I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, someone called his name from the other end of the bar. He threw me one last, lingering glance before walking away, leaving me sitting there, heart pounding, lips parted with words I never got to say. I didn't leave. I told myself I was just enjoying the atmosphere, the music, the people. But in reality, I was waiting. And Diego, he knew it. An hour passed. He moved between customers, occasionally meeting my gaze with that knowing look, as if testing me, waiting to see if I'd break first. And then, when I least expected it, he leaned toward one of his co-workers, whispered something, and disappeared through a door behind the bar. 5 minutes later, he returned, but not behind the counter. He walked directly toward me. My stomach tightened as he stopped beside my stool. The air around us felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name. "You've been here a while," he said, his voice quieter now, meant only for me. I nodded. His lips curved into something dangerously close to a challenge. "Come with me." It wasn't a question. It was an invitation. I should have said no. I should have played it safe. But instead, I stood up and followed him, my heart racing, my mind buzzing with the realization that I was stepping into something I couldn't undo. I didn't know where this would lead. I just knew that I wanted to find out. The moment I stepped through the dimly lit hallway behind the bar, my pulse quickened. The music from outside felt distant now, muffled by thick walls. But the energy between Diego and me crackled like static in the air. He walked ahead, confident, without hesitation. I followed, my breath uneven, my body tense with anticipation. At the end of the hall, he pushed open a door, revealing a small, private courtyard. The warm Mexican night wrapped around us, the scent of citrus and salt in the air. A single bulb flickered above, casting a golden glow over Diego's face as he turned to face me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, he leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze sharp, assessing. "So," he said, voice low, "why did you follow me?" I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "You told me to." Diego chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I invited you. There's a difference." I knew he was testing me, pushing to see how far I was willing to go. I had never been in a moment like this before, so charged, so full of something unspoken but undeniable. I took a slow step forward. "And what happens now?" His smirk faded, replaced by something darker, something unreadable. "That depends on you." The space between us was closing, and I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my ears. There was a pull between us, something magnetic, impossible to ignore. And then it happened. Diego reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of my shirt. Barely a touch, but it burned. My breath hitched. He was close enough now that I could see the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, the silent challenge he was laying out. If I wanted to walk away, this was my chance. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly we were too close. His breath was warm against my lips, his body inches from mine. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to make a choice, to do something, anything. And then, a noise. A door slamming somewhere nearby. Diego tensed, his hand dropping, his expression shifting into something guarded. The moment shattered in an instant, leaving nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. A voice called his name from inside. Someone looking for him. Diego exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. I have to go. I nodded, my skin still buzzing from his touch. Yeah. But before he stepped away, he hesitated, his eyes locking onto mine, his jaw tightening as if fighting some internal battle. And then, quietly, he said, "Come back tomorrow." It wasn't a request. It was a promise. I watched as he disappeared through the door, leaving me alone in the warm night air, my entire body on fire with the realization that I had just crossed a line I could never uncross, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The way his fingers had barely touched my shirt yet left my skin burning. The way his voice had dropped when he told me to come back. The way his eyes had darkened just before we were interrupted. I should have walked away. I should have convinced myself it was just a moment, a fleeting attraction that meant nothing. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The next evening, I found myself walking down the same lively street, past the same glowing bars and pulsing music. I didn't have to think about where I was going, I knew. My feet carried me there as if they had a mind of their own, and when I stepped inside, Diego was already watching me. He was behind the bar again, leaning against the counter with a lazy smirk like he'd been waiting. "You came back," he said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. I slid onto the stool, feeling my pulse quicken. "You told me to," he chuckled, shaking his head as he reached for a bottle. "I invited you," he corrected, just like before. I exhaled, watching him pour me a drink. This was different from last night. There was no crowd between us, no guessing game. It was just us, and we both knew why I was here. Diego slid the glass across the bar, his fingers brushing against mine deliberately this time. "I get off in 20 minutes, he said, his voice quieter, more intimate. My throat went dry. My heart slammed against my ribs. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. I nodded, fingers tightening around my glass. 20 minutes felt like an eternity. I sipped my drink, barely tasting it, my mind buzzing with the weight of what was about to happen. Diego worked with practiced ease, moving around the bar, but his eyes kept flicking to me, watching, teasing, promising. And then, finally, he untied his apron, tossed it aside, and walked straight toward me. "Let's go." I stood, pulse hammering, and followed him out the back door. The night air was thick, the sky painted in deep shades of blue and purple. Diego led me down a quiet alleyway, away from the noise, away from everything. His steps were confident, but when he finally stopped, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hesitation. Uncertainty. For the first time, I saw that beneath all that confidence, there was something real. We stood there, inches apart, the night stretching between us. And then, before I could second-guess anything, Diego reached for me. His fingers curled around the back of my neck, pulling me closer. My breath caught as I felt the warmth of his body against mine, the scent of tequila and something unmistakably him. He hesitated, just for a second. Just long enough for me to know that this wasn't just a game to him either. And then his lips brushed against mine. Soft at first, testing. A slow, agonizing moment where we both knew we could stop, pull away. but neither of us did. I pressed into him, and suddenly everything was fire. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me flush against him. My fingers tangled in his hair. The kiss deepened, slow and hungry, like we were making up for all the time we'd wasted dancing around this. I didn't care that we were in an alley, that someone could walk by at any second. I didn't care about anything except him. And when we finally broke apart, breathless, Diego rested his forehead against mine, his voice barely above a whisper. I shouldn't want this. I swallowed hard, my fingers still gripping his shirt. Neither should I. But we both knew we did, and there was no turning back now. Diego didn't pull away. For a long moment, we just stood there, breathing in the same air, feeling the weight of what had just happened. His hands were still on my waist, firm but hesitant, as if he wasn't sure whether to let go or hold on tighter. I didn't want him to let go. The world around us faded, the street noise, the distant music, the passing footsteps of strangers who had no idea what was happening in this dark alleyway. None of it mattered. Diego exhaled, his breath warm against my lips. This is crazy. I swallowed hard. Then why does it feel right? He didn't answer right away. Instead, his fingers traced slow, burning circles over my hip, his body still pressed against mine. The hesitation in his eyes was battling with something deeper, something he didn't want to admit. I could feel it, just like I could feel my own pulse hammering in my chest. Diego took a step back, running a hand through his already messy hair. His jaw was clenched, like he was trying to pull himself together. This, he started, shaking his head. This isn't what I do. I frowned. What do you mean? His eyes flickered to mine, conflicted. Guys like you come here for a few days, have some fun, and then leave. I don't get involved. His words stung more than I expected. Was that what he thought this was? Just a vacation fling? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. Is that what you think I'm doing? Diego exhaled sharply, looking away. I don't know. I could see the walls going up again. The same confidence that had pulled me in last night was now turning into distance, like he was already trying to push me away. But I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. I stepped closer. I didn't come here looking for this, Diego. I didn't expect to meet you. But I did, and now I can't pretend it doesn't mean something. His jaw tightened. It's easier if we do. I scoffed. Easier for who? His eyes snapped back to mine, and for a second I thought he was going to push me away completely. But instead he grabbed my wrist, gently, but with a quiet urgency. You don't understand, he murmured, his voice lower now. I don't let people in. My chest tightened. I could see the truth in his face, the struggle between what he wanted and what he was afraid of. But before I could say anything else, a voice interrupted us. Diego? We both froze. I turned to see a man standing at the entrance of the alley, a local, probably in his late 20s, with sharp eyes and an expression that immediately told me this wasn't someone Diego wanted to see right now. Diego dropped my wrist like I'd burned him. His entire posture changed. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched, and the easy confidence from before was replaced by something guarded. The man took a slow step forward, his gaze flicking between us before landing on Diego. What the hell is this? I didn't know who he was, but I could feel the tension in Diego's body, the way his breath hitched ever so slightly. I looked at Diego, waiting for him to say something, but he just stared at the guy, lips parted, silent. And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just some random interruption. Whoever this man was, he meant something to Diego. And suddenly, the night didn't feel so warm anymore. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Diego's body had gone rigid, his jaw clenched tight. I could see the flicker of emotions in his eyes, shock, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite place. The man standing in the alley with us, tall, broad-shouldered, dark eyes full of accusation, didn't move right away. But when he finally spoke, his voice was sharp. "I didn't expect to find you like this." Diego exhaled, shaking his head. "Matteo, it's not—" Matteo. The name settled in my chest like a weight. I wasn't stupid. I could feel that this wasn't just some friend or a random guy checking in on Diego. There was history here, something unresolved. Matteo's gaze flickered to me, sizing me up in a single glance before settling back on Diego. "So, this is what you're doing now?" His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the edge of something deeper beneath it. Diego sighed, running a hand through his hair, frustration leaking into his features. "It's none of your business." Matteo let out a sharp breath, stepping closer. "It was my business, once." My stomach twisted. I wasn't sure if I should speak or just let them handle whatever this was, but my presence here suddenly felt like a spotlight shining on something neither of them wanted exposed. Diego turned to me then, his face conflicted, his lips pressing into a tight line. "Can you give me a minute?" His voice was soft, almost reluctant. Everything in me wanted to say no. I didn't want to walk away, didn't want to let whatever was happening between us be pushed aside like it was nothing. But I also knew this wasn't just about me anymore. I nodded stiffly. "Yeah." Diego held my gaze for a second longer, something unsaid passing between us, before I stepped back and walked away, my chest tight, my head spinning. I didn't go far. I stood near the entrance of the alley, just far enough that they probably thought I couldn't hear, but I could, and what I heard made my pulse pound. "You're still running, aren't you?" Matteo's voice was lower now, rough with something I couldn't place. Diego didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't catch it, he said, "I'm not running." Matteo scoffed. "Then what do you call this?" Diego exhaled sharply. "I don't owe you an explanation." "No?" Matteo laughed bitterly. "So you're just going to keep pretending? Keep pushing away anyone who actually gives a damn about you?" There was a long pause. A painful one. Then Diego's voice, softer, almost broken. "That's easier." My stomach twisted. I could feel it now. The fear in Diego's words, the way he was fighting something inside himself. This wasn't just about me. This was about him, about his past, about whatever had made him believe that wanting something, wanting someone, was wrong. I stepped away then, giving them real space because I knew this wasn't a conversation I was meant to be a part of. But as I walked back toward the crowded streets, one thought clawed at my mind. I didn't want to be just another thing Diego ran from. I wanted him to stay. I sat on the edge of the beach, my feet sinking into the warm sand as the waves rolled in, rhythmic and steady, like my own racing thoughts. The distant hum of music from the bars, the laughter of tourists, the scent of salt in the air. It was all there. But I couldn't focus on any of it, because all I could think about was him. I didn't know how long I sat there before I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Diego. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, the space between us heavy with everything unsaid. Then slowly, he lowered himself to sit beside me, close enough that our arms almost touched. The ocean stretched before us, endless and quiet. "You left," I said, breaking the silence. Diego exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't know what to say. I let out a dry chuckle. That's a first. He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. For the first time since I met him, he looked uncertain, vulnerable even, like the version of him that always had a clever comeback was stripped away, leaving something raw underneath. I turned to face him. Who is he? Diego didn't look at me right away. He stared at the waves, his fingers digging into the sand. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Someone I cared about. Someone I pushed away. I waited, letting him take his time. Diego let out a slow breath. Matteo wanted more. He paused, shaking his head. I wasn't ready. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. I swallowed hard. And what about me? He finally met my gaze then, his dark eyes searching mine. That's what scares me, he admitted. My chest tightened, because this wasn't just about him not being ready. It was about him being afraid of letting someone in, of letting himself feel something real. I could have walked away right then. I could have saved myself the heartache, the risk, the uncertainty. But instead, I did something I hadn't planned. I reached out, my fingers brushing over his. Not grabbing, not pulling. Just there. An open invitation, nothing more. For a second, he hesitated. And then, finally, he laced his fingers through mine. Not much, not dramatic. Just a simple, quiet choice, but it was enough. Because in that moment, Diego wasn't running. He was staying.